I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. And in light of April being Child Abuse Prevention Month, we wanted to explore what is being done in New York to prevent child abuse, as well as shine a light on important services and supports for survivors. Joining us remotely is Melanie Hartzog, President and CEO of the New York Foundling, which supports children and families in need. Thanks for making the time, Melanie.
Oh, thank you for having me. And please call me Mel. No one calls me Melanie unless it's my mother and I'm in trouble. So,
I'll do my best, but no guarantees. So, I guess for starters, what stands out to you, either for good or ill, when you think about the state's approach to child abuse, or maybe some of the things that it's emphasizing right now?
if I step back and think about when I started in this world, 20 plus years ago, we in New York City had 17,000 children in foster care. That is an astronomical amount of children being removed from their homes, family disruption, you name it. And we're now down in New York City to 6,000 children. And I think that really speaks to the state's efforts, the city's efforts to really invest in prevention and what works. And prevention not just being more preventive services, evidence-based practice, which is what the New York Foundling is known for. We really launched evidence-based practice here in New York City that's been adopted by the Administration for Children's Services, but also things like housing. Healthy Families is another program that the state, runs that I truly love, but really focusing on upstream as much as possible supports that families need to prevent child abuse and ultimately to keep families intact and not remove children and place them in foster care.
Well, you reference Healthy Families New York, which is designed to provide, I guess, voluntary home-based social and educational services to expecting and those new families that might have higher needs or present certain risk factors for child abuse. What does that look like in practice, and how effective is something like that?
It's extremely effective. And in practice, the Foundling serves about 112 families each year on the Staten Island. And what I love about the program is that, we have moms with multiple children, right? So it's not just about being that first time mom. As a mother of three, that second child is very different than how I, gave birth and to my son, my first child, and then three children later. For me, parenting is really different. And I love that our program, Healthy Families, operated by the state, really gives us the opportunity to work with mom, all of the children, and all of her family members in the household. And so that type of support really makes the difference. It's not just about that first child or the newborn, the first one, it's about the whole family.
Sticking with the idea of some of the underlying conditions that might contribute to child abuse, obviously certain people or certain conditions might be at higher risk, but I mean, anyone could potentially be susceptible to this if there are certain, I guess, triggers in their life. So what are some of the ways the state can try to avoid some of those broader socioeconomic triggers?
It's really weaving together all the different programs and supports across the state operates as well as localities. So when you think about what we see often is housing instability. Our governor talks about it, our mayor for sure, and they're investing in those resources. But that's one of the things when you talk about those triggers that leads to that instability, that leads to children being removed from their homes. So how do we keep families, right, stably housed? Food is another one. Food insecurity, we're seeing a very significant rise in that. Not only do we provide pantries on Staten Island, but the state also has the Medicaid waiver program, which we're participating in, that can provide those supports to families in addition to SNAP benefits. So, oftentimes I think we make it more complex than it truly is. There are basic supports that families need that, is not rocket science, housing, food, that really, when you have those basic supports, you're able, right, to really focus on you, your family, what else is needed, education, all of those other things fall into place.
Well, you've been highlighting some of the evidence-backed ideas to prevent child abuse, but I have to imagine there are also some ideas that maybe have been permeating for years and aren't necessarily representative of how to actually best treat child abuse or respond to child abuse or prevent child abuse. Is that ever a problem? Are there different stigmas or things that you think permeate the different policy solutions that need to be addressed? Or is this an area where you feel like we are primarily pursuing evidence-based prevention and response solutions?
Well, that's a very good question. Me thinking there. I do think that there's a lot to say about the evidence-based practice that's in place, but I also think there are programs that are not as costly, that are a little bit more, school-based programs, for example, that we run that are just as impactful. So I think about our child abuse prevention program. We serve about 20,000 students annually across 120 schools. It's a model I'd love to see across the state, but really what we do is go in, our staff work with puppets, model out different scenarios that could happen with children and process it. What does this mean? What is a good touch, etc. And, what you see after that intervention is students walking up to social workers in the school, to our staff, to talk about their experiences. So you immediately see an impact right on the spot of a true intervention and getting that child the needed supports. And so, from my perspective, that's not the intensive therapy, more of the preventive models that we run, evidence-based, but it is right then and there an immediate impact and immediate support that can be offered to that child. And we've expanded our program to middle schoolers now because of all of the online exploitation that you see and hear about. Um, and those workshops are done really targeting middle schoolers around what can happen with exploitation online, how to prevent that, and again, how to immediately get those supports in place. And so it's a program that's very near and dear to the Foundling. We've been at that program for over 20 years. And, it's again, not as costly, but the impact that you can think about, return on investment is tremendous.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking about efforts to address child abuse in New York, and our guest is Melanie Hartzog, President and CEO of the New York Foundling. So, Mel, I want to turn to the other side of this equation and how the state, I guess, responds to child abuse. And there have been changes that we've seen in recent years about things like anonymous reporting and moving away from that in favor of confidential reporting. And this year, mandated reporters must complete a new training that is more, say, trauma informed than it might have been in the past. When you think about some of these moving parts, what do you think about the direction the state is heading in? And does it seem to be in, I guess, the best interest of the kids and families who might need supports and services?
Oh, 100%, absolutely. From my perspective and that of the Foundling, the state is moving in the right direction. Just as you've mentioned, anonymous reporting, to more of the preventive services up front that we can offer families, it is absolutely the right direction. Because remember, we're talking about families who ultimately, if they weren't as stressed, whether it's housing instability or food, or even support with their child and understanding, do they need to have an assessment? Do they have a child that needs early intervention services, right? All of those things that we can offer as support, case management support, are critical for a struggling family that ultimately leads to less intervention by the child welfare system. And any effort that leads to less intervention of the child welfare system is worth us exploring, considering, implementing, seeing what works. And if it does, then expanding and scaling. Absolutely. And I applaud the state for that effort. They've really led the way.
So that is not a new refrain that we've heard on this show, this idea that you want to avoid interactions with the child welfare system. And to that end, we've talked about ways to prevent people from getting caught up in the child welfare system. But does that fact that people are so consciously concerned about the child welfare system suggest that that needs to be part of the focus as well, overhauling its approach and its efficacy? Because it seems like it has a role to play, and we might not necessarily want to steer everyone away from it, but I guess we would want to expect better outcomes when people are in it. I mean, is that something that is reasonable to expect?
Yes, 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 yes. I think that we want to focus on prevention, but we do have children that are in our care And we absolutely should have outcomes for them that are set. We at the Foundling really care about permanency. That is our top priority. If you're coming into our care, we want to make sure that you are one, first and foremost, if we can, place you with a family member. And so we go out of our way to really look at caregivers in that child or children's life. It could be a relative or a very close family to the family. We want to make sure that you are with somebody that you know, because the idea of just taking a child from their home is traumatic, right? In of itself, that is trauma. And then the trauma of placing a child in another home, even if it's another caregiver or relative, is traumatic as well. So you want to really think about how do we ease that, knowing that it's already a traumatic experience, and then really working with the family, with the parents, to get that child right back home. That is the top goal. When it is a permanency is that goal, that's what we try to do. And we are very proud that we tied as number one in New York City for permanency goals. But the other thing too is about your practice when that child is in care. How are we connecting with, that mom or that father? How are we making them feel, right? Because they're also going through the trauma of losing their child, even if it's to a relative. And there's a traumatic experience for them. And so being really thoughtful about how you approach the practice matters a lot. And we've stopped using terms like, oh, birth parent. I mean, we were just talking before about, our own children and your soon to be. Could you imagine the experience of someone saying you're the birth father? No, you're a father, right? I'm a mother. And so even changing some of that practice and language, and how we communicate is really important. The Foundling is part of an effort led by Graham Wyndham and along with Good Shepherd Services, where we're really trying to change our practice around how, when families come into our care and foster care, how do we communicate? How do we treat them? Because it's really, really important. And times have changed, and we need to really change our practice.
What about rules and regulations that you are handed down from the state, for example? Does that ever limit your capacity to take on kids or hinder your ability on a day-to-day basis to try to do this work? Because right now, the governor has put out this call for cutting red tape, and we often hear upstate from northern rivers about the need to cut red tape. Is that something that ever slows down your work, for example?
Right, and I will say this because before this, I spent many years in government, in New York City government, working for two different mayors, and there's always red tape and there's always practice changes that, right, if in fact you could cut it, would be great. I think one of the biggest things that I found very frustrating coming into this role is actually not the state, it's how it's federal
Mm,
in how we treat families that we call kinship. They go through the same process and background checks, which are all relevant things, but we treat family members the same way that we would treat a, individual who's interested in being a foster parent or what we call now resource parents. They're treated the same. And if I am known to child, I'm the aunt, let's say, why am I treated the same way and having to go through the same process as, someone who's not known?
sure.
So little things like that can really make a difference because when you're trying to place a child with a family member and you're trying to explain to this family member, thank you so much for wanting to take care of your nephew, for example. Here's the 50 different steps you have to take, right? It's like, well, wait a minute. I'm the aunt. Why am I having to do all this? What does this mean? So it does slow down the process. Now, of course, we always want to put the child's safety as paramount. I'm not suggesting that we skip critical safety steps, but there are things that could be expedited and change in that process that would make it a lot easier. And I know there's other things that we're looking at in the preventive side of the world that the state is very on board with that are taking some time to change. Things like, if we're accepting a preventive case from the community, right, that family is voluntarily coming into our care. The way that we have to work with that family can be the same way as a family who's being mandated into services for preventive. And that creates a lot of tension. You can imagine trying to work with a family that's saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not mandated to get care or receive care. I'm voluntarily wanting the support. Why am I being treated in this way? So it gets a little tricky in practice on how you explain that. Those are things that the state is looking into, I know for sure, on how we could, you know, change that for the better so that when families do want to, and what we want to see, I always say this is, right, if a family needs preventive services, they voluntarily, I would like to see more families get services and not be mandated to receive services, right? That they voluntarily want to get care. What are some of the ways we can make that easier and more accessible for them?
Lastly, is there a stigma that needs to be addressed before families feel comfortable to ask for help, to reach out for services? Because I wonder, in addition to being concerned about how they're perceived, there's also that fear that if I ask for help, I'm going to lose my kids.
That's right. And that's one of the things with preventive, right? Which is, why do I have to be known to the child welfare system in order to access services? And so there's much, and this is great. I think we're all now starting to talk about this, whether it's at the city level or the state level. For sure, here in New York City, I know the mayor cares a lot about this work, but, you know, how do we create more support for family well-being? And what does that look like outside of the child welfare system? To your point, right, that stigma of, but this agency is about removing children from their home or investigating families for potential abuse or neglect. But they're also offering all of these upstream
Sure.
well-being services. Think of family enrichment centers, which is another amazing model. Is there a different way to provide those services that removes the stigma and that fear that prevents sometimes families from accessing services?
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with Melanie Hartzog. She's the president and CEO of the New York Foundling. Mel, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Great conversation. Thank you.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.